Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if there was a scramble for China? Now this video I have to give a shout out to my main man Jamie. Big up yourself. Boyakasha. Now for everyone who's a little bit confused by that, basically Jamie is one of our supporters and he commented in the thing. So the video I was going to do for today was actually going to be to do with Brexit. That video is going to come either next week or the week afterwards. But you know, as he requested it, I'm going to be doing this one today because his comments was hilarious. Like he has his thumbnail is that of Ali G. So in the comment I started doing some Ali G jokes, and like both of us kind of did it back to each other. So as a result of that, I was like, you know what, I'm sold on that. Like we're doing the China video, right? Now the thing to understand with China is that unlike most other countries in the world, it's not really a country, it's kind of more of a civilization, right? So the word China, as said by the Chinese, is Zhao Gong, Zonggao. I think I'm bad with pronunciation, but that basically means the Middle Kingdom, right? So actually, I hope I didn't say anything rude the first time I said it in China. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, it means Middle Kingdom, right? So this is basically the Middle Kingdom between heaven and the rest of Earth, right? So this kind of gives you an idea of how the Chinese view themselves, right? And especially how they viewed their emperor, like at the time when they had empires, right? We're not going to talk about all the other dynasties and stuff yet. Like we'll mention them if they're relevant to this video, but like there's a lot of dynasties, right? But what you have to understand is that, from the very first dynasty, the Zhao dynasty, they basically came up with the idea of the mandate for heaven, right? So the mandate of heaven is basically this idea, which is very much of a Confucianist idea. So when Confucianism, you have like an ordered society and stuff, yeah. So the son and the father, like the emperor and his people, right? So in that regard, that's kind of the way to kind of think about it, right? So if you have the mandate for heaven, that means that like heaven itself has ordained that you have the divine right to rule the empire, right? However, if something happens that's like bad, like even if it's something that's completely out of your control, like a natural disaster or something, yeah, if enough of those can happen, then the people have every right to basically rise up against the dynasty that's ruling, yeah, whatever like ruling regime it is, right? So that's kind of something to kind of bear in mind, yeah, that like this, you don't really see these kind of checks and balances in other countries, right? You don't see it in other civilizations. Okay, we're in our democratic system, if you don't like people, you vote them out of office, right? But like there's never this idea of like, someone who's supposed to be this absolute monarch can be overthrown by the people and a new dynasty be set up in its place if they're not doing the right thing, right? Which is, it's good in a way because of level of accountability, but it's also quite an interesting kind of way of looking at things, right? The next dynasty after the Zhao was the Jin Dynasty, right? So this is where we get the word China from, so like the Qin. So this is the first dynasty that comes up with kind of what one could refer to as Chinese legalism, right? So if you have legalism, it's basically this idea of a kind of bureaucratic state, basically, yeah? So whereas in many other countries around the world at this time, the way to like rise up and stuff, yeah, was to win in war, whatever, or to curry favor with like the emperor or the king or whatever, and basically then you become a knight and become a member of the nobility. In China, it was very much a meritocratic system, right? So the centralized state, right, which was far more centralized than most other civilizations around the world and stuff, right? The way to rise up there was by being competent, was by passing examinations, yeah, so prove that you were smart and like etc. And that was kind of the way to kind of like move up and stuff, right? And also you start to see, so the first like emperor of China as such, like what we kind of think of, he's the one who like had the famous terracotta army and stuff, and he also is the one who began to build the Great Wall of China, right? So from very, very early on, if you think about it, like imagine having the Roman Empire still exist today, yeah, with the exact same kind of culture. That's basically the way to think of China, yeah. It's like this continuation through thousands and thousands of years of history, right? Right, fast forward in now about like 1,000 years, there's many different dynasties, they all keep kind of changing and stuff, etc, etc. Some of them are more based up in the north, some of them are more based down in the south. So, China's geography, the way to think about it is that like in the north of China, you have the same kind of temperature, the same kind of climate as you would in Europe, whereas in the south, it tends to be more tropical, you have more rice farms, etc, etc. So, if left to its own devices, yeah, China will end up kind of being split along these kind of lines. And on top of that as well, China's obviously huge. It's about like the same size of like Europe or America, and obviously it has so many many more people than either of them. So, so like each of the different provinces, if left to their own devices, can basically become like little competing kingdoms. So whenever you end up having a dynasty that collapses, what ends up happening is that you end up having a period of like the warring states. So basically there ends up being a vie for power for who's going to take control over all of China. Anyway, fast forward from this, you end up having the Mongols invading, and when the Mongols invaded, as we discussed in our previous video on what if the Mongols invaded Japan, what you end up seeing is that any society that ends up being invaded by foreigners, especially foreigners as brutal as the Mongols, right? Yeah, because obviously tens of millions of Chinese people end up being massacred and stuff, right? So what ends up happening is that they end up becoming inward looking, right? They become insular and they end up becoming incredibly xenophobic. So the dynasty that takes on after the Yuan dynasty ends up being the Ming dynasty, right? And apart from a few kind of explorers, so for instance you had Zheng He, and so he was an explorer, had a massive navy, and it sailed to India and it sailed all the way to like the east coast of Africa and stuff. So so in spite of people like him, the reaction of the Ming dynasty was like, no, we don't really, we don't want foreigners, we don't actually need foreigners, and like so the whole rest of the world, basically we're not bothered by them. And also as well, something to understand is that the Chinese, the very first country which they ever recognized was Russia in 1860. Now we're going to get onto that a little bit later, but this kind of gives you an idea of how the Chinese have always viewed foreign policy, right? So the idea of like basically each kind of neighboring state, or just foreigners in general, right? They're made up of barbarians, and they are all tributaries to the Middle Kingdom, right? So whether you have Korean or Japanese or Vietnamese or whatever it is, right? When they come to China, they are paying tribute to the emperor, right? And so that's kind of the way to view it, right? They're not on equal terms, yeah? You're not on equal terms with the Middle Kingdom, right? You are inferior, right? And it's a privilege for you, like if you decide to come, it's a privilege for you to even like be allowed to like talk to like the emperor and stuff, right? So this is how the Chinese basically viewed foreign policy, that they are the very center of the world, that other people come to them for things like silk and tea, etc., but that they don't need other things, right? They don't need the rest of the world. So fast forward now to like the modern age, you can kind of see like this mentality clashing with basically the modern like kind of like European world. So the next dynasty that takes over after the Ming is the Jin Dynasty, right? And they rule from 1644 up until 1912. And just like the Mongols before, this dynasty came from outsiders, right? So this is the Manchus, who like today live in northern China, but they are not the same as like the majority Han people. So they end up taking over. But what is happening is much the same way as we had with the Mongols, right? The Chinese, they are basically, there's so many of them that any rulers that end up taking over end up becoming Sinicized, right? So within a few generations, they basically end up becoming Chinese, right? They use the same bureaucracy, they use the same tax system, they have the same culture, speak the same language, etc., as the native Chinese. So for all intents and purposes, they end up taking over the same mindset as the Ming dynasty had beforehand, and nearly every other dynasty that preceded them, right? They end up basically seeing the whole rest of the world as barbarians, and they are the most important people in the whole world. So in the 1790s, China was at its absolute zenith. Its population was about a third of the entire world, and it was either the number one or the number two largest economy in the whole world at this time. So absolute massive. So it really does earn its name as like kind of the Middle Kingdom, right? So what one would expect is that like the other powers around the world would also still continue to recognize that, right? No, because the British at this time, they already had the empire on which the sun never set, right? And that phrase was coined by Earl George Macartney, right? So Earl George Macartney, he was an emissary who was sent by King George III. Yes, that King George, the same one who's in Hamilton. So anyway, he was sent by King George III. So England at this time was the largest empire, right? And it was the most powerful country in like the whole world. Like kind of it had control over like, all the seas, right? At that time, Britain really did rule the waves. And so one would expect that now that the tide of geopolitical like balance has been turned, that the Chinese would kind of understand that and kind of be like, okay, these Westerners are far, far in advance of where we are. Their technology is far superior, etc., etc. Let's humble ourselves and actually recognize what's kind of going on here, right? No, that didn't happen. Instead, in 1792 to 1793, L. Macartney, he went to visit the emperor, right? And he had all these trinkets, all these kind of, you know, telescopes and all these kind of things, which are products of the Age of Enlightenment and like kind of the scientific revolution and industrial revolution. So he thought that, like, right, showing these to the emperor is going to see this and go, wow, look at all these things that these clever like Westerners have and stuff, right? So clearly there's stuff that we can buy off of them, yeah, like all these clocks and everything, yeah. And, you know, also we have to humble ourselves and recognize that the British are now kind of far ahead of us, right? However, this didn't happen. And it goes back to what we said before about the Chinese and their tributary system, right? So basically the Chinese emperor's response was, okay, thank you for making the effort. Thank you for coming all this way. You don't really know where your country is, don't really care. These tributes are really nice, but we don't really need them. And actually, I'll read a quote from you. This came straight from the Emperor Qianlong. Apology if I mispronounced the name, right? So this is the quote from him. Our celestial empire possesses all things in a prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. So that's not a very nice way to like respond to your guests, right? First of all, calling them barbarians, probably not the best idea. And second of all, this arrogance of basically being like, okay, we have everything in the whole world. Why do we need to trade with you? At no point we don't need any of your things, yeah, right? There might be more technical, whatever. These are just trinkets, right? We don't actually care, right? So the British were not very pleased with this, right? And on top of that, there was another thing. So we in England have like the word kowtow, and it comes as a result of what ended up happening next, right? So if you're kowtowing to someone, right, you go before your superior, in particular like the Emperor of China and stuff, right, and you get on both knees, and your forehead touches the actual ground and stuff, right? So it's not even just bowing, it's like proper like prostrating yourself in front of someone, right? And this is what the Chinese emperor expected all foreigners to do and stuff. Well, for anyone in the presence of the emperor had to kowtow. And, you know, McCartney was like, hold on, first of all, no, I'm not doing that, right? I wouldn't even do this for my own king. Like, why would I do it? Like, literally in England, no one would do this for anyone, right? Like, you know, bowing, like curtsying, yeah, fine, genuflecting, whatever, but not kowtowing, right? We're not going to do that. And so basically, you know, as a compromise, he was like, okay, how about this? Yeah, I'll kowtow as long as there's a Chinese person who also kowtows to a painting of King George III. To which the Chinese just laughed, like, "Are you stupid? Like, do you understand what you're even saying? Yeah, like, this is the emperor of the Middle Kingdom, right? This is, you know, this is someone sent by heaven, right? And you're comparing the Emperor of China with this King George III. Like, I even say it no. So as a result of this, yeah, this ended up leading to a lot of tension, a lot of cultural misunderstanding. I believe eventually there ends up being the compromise that he would like genuflect. So the same way that he would like do to King George, he ended up eventually doing that to the emperor. This gives the first taste of like how like the you know, the East versus West and like the kind of clashes that we're about to see now. So in 1839, this marks the beginning of the so-called Century of Humiliation, which isn't exactly a century, it goes on a little bit longer than a century, but this is the term that the Chinese have for the period which I'm about to describe, right? So between 1839 to 1949, which the CCP, you know, the Chinese government basically say this is like, you know, the Century of Humiliation, because it ends when like the CCP basically take control of China. But before that, in this time, this is when the Europeans end up basically humiliating China in various different things. And the very beginning of this humiliation begins with the First Opium War, right? So, you know, at the present day, we have a war on drugs. This was the first war for drugs, right? So basically, you know, as we discussed in our last video when we talked about the British in India, so the British obviously controlled large parts of India and stuff. And around this time, like, they was like, okay, right, we need to sell stuff to the Chinese in order to get tea, right? So tea was a massive thing. Yeah, but I believe something along the lines of about 10% of British government revenue came from the sale of tea, right? And this is obviously why you have like the Boston Tea Party, etc., etc. It's kind of because this is a good source of revenue for like the British Treasury, right? So tea is very important. However, the only thing that the Chinese are going to use to buy this tea is silver. And the British were running low on silver, as a result of like the mines in Latin America, like all the different Latin American countries becoming independent. It becomes a little bit harder to get silver, and they don't really have silver themselves, etc. So, the only thing they can sell is silver, and they're kind of going, okay, we need to find something else to buy this tea with, right? So they decided, Chinese people like smoking opium, right? What if we in India, because we've got lots of fields, we've got lots of like space for it, stuff, it's good soil, etc. What if we grow opium and then sell it to the Chinese? This is a really good idea. And so, it ends up being a lot cheaper and a lot like of a higher quality than what they get in China for it, right? And so as a result, lots of Chinese people end up like taking even more opium than they were before. So the Chinese government basically goes, okay, a lot of our people are becoming opium addicts. We need to crack down on this, right? And this ends up just leading to like the British smuggling it in and stuff, right? So what ends up happening though is that the Chinese emperor gets really like a hard line on it, and he appoints a minister with the express thing of cracking down on opium, not just on users, but also on the distributors of it, i.e. like the British who are selling it and stuff, right? So the Chinese only allowed one port in the whole of China to like where like the Westerners could trade from, and this is Canton, which today is Guangdong. So we get the name like Canton from that, Cantonese. We get it from the name of this city because it's been anglicized and stuff. But Canton, Guangdong, basically this is the only port from which Westerners can sell things to the Chinese, right? So the Chinese government ends up cracking down on this, ends up arresting some of the merchants who are there and stuff, right? And the person who's there, like the British emissary and stuff, who's a representative of the East India Company, he's like, okay, try and find some sort of compromise, try and find some sort of negotiation. And he tells the merchants there, we'll find compensation for you guys at some point, etc., etc. However, when news of this reaches London, the parliament there very narrowly ends up voting to go to war for drugs, right? So they end up sending like ironclad ships, right? So like these are like ironclad steam ships. So before this, like all kind of ships like had been made out of wood. But as a result of like the Industrial Revolution, you had the first ships which were made out of iron, right? So these ironclad ships, the most notorious of which was called the Nemesis. Basically, this ended up going to China and completely wiped out like the Chinese junks that they had. So junks is the name for like the Chinese ships that they had up there, and that's probably where the phrase piece of junk comes from. But anyway, so they end up completely humiliating them there, and basically was like, right, you're going to buy opium or us, yeah, right? You're going to have free trade. We're forcing free trade on you, right? And so you have to allow your citizens, if they want our opium, to sell it, right? It's basically supply and demand, but at the same time, imagine if a country today was invaded or at least like attacked and stuff, because it refused to buy narcotics from someone else, right? That's kind of the best way to like think about it. And as a result, the Chinese end up protesting against this, and there end up being a Second Opium War. Now, during the Second Opium War, this is when the Russians end up taking advantage of this, and they end up seizing large parts of what's now Siberia, and they end up taking the port of Vladivostok. So this is the first time, the Treaty of, I can't pronounce that name, but that treaty is the first time that the Chinese ever officially recognized the existence of another country, right? So see, we tied that in very nicely. Now, as if it wasn't bad enough that they were humiliated in these wars, on top of that, the Westerners enforced unequal treaties, right? So, for instance, the reason why the British have Hong Kong, well, had Hong Kong, is as a result of one of these unequal treaties, right? So, they end up taking like control over it, and basically, like they forced on the Chinese, like that they had to allow the free movement of merchants and stuff throughout the whole of China, so the Chinese, whether they wanted to or not, had to buy things from the Westerners. It's not like they went and forced people to buy like Western products, but it was a thing where the Chinese government had no jurisdiction on what like Westerners could or could not sell to their own citizens. So this is kind of what ended up happening during this time. And also, as a result of this, you end up having a lot of Chinese people who are very resentful of this. Yeah, a lot of like Chinese nationalists, especially amongst the peasant class, right? So around the turn of the last century, you end up having what was set up as the Fighting Fists, or I can't remember the exact name of it. I've got it on screen now. But basically, these people end up being known by Westerners as the Boxers, right? So these are Chinese nationalists, and basically their aim was to basically kick out Western influence, to kick out like the Christian missionaries, to kill Chinese Christian converts and stuff. So that was basically their aim, yeah, to like restore China, yeah, basically make China great again as such. However, when they did this, yeah, so this is the Boxer Rebellion is 1899 to 1901. When it happening is that it wasn't just the British or the French or the Russian, etc., etc. It was an 8-nation army, yeah, which made up of Britain, France, Russia, Japan, America, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, right? So all these different people came together. Yeah, because also as well, something to note is that the Boxer Rebellion, it was supported by the Empress Dowager. I can't remember how to pronounce her name. Sorry about that. You know, like, so she was like more of a representative of the conservative wing of like the imperial court. And so she kind of was like, okay, we're going to use these peasants to basically kick the Westerners out of China and stuff, right? Now, this ended up being really badly crushed. And in our own timeline, what ended up happening as a result of this rebellion is that the Chinese were forced to pay reparations to the Western governments, right? So from 1901 to 1939, the equivalent of, well, if you use like 2010 US dollars, right? Over that time of almost 40 years, $61 billion worth of silver ended up having to be paid to these 8 nations, right? As compensation for what was lost during this rebellion. But what if instead of that, they had decided, right, what we're going to do is we're going to, in the same way we had the scramble for Africa, like a decade or so before, we're going to have a scramble for China. So that's the premise of this alternative history. Now, as we always say in our videos, this would never have happened because there was no reason for the Europeans to do this, right? Now, a lot of people have this idea that, like, they have a very kind of mercantilist idea of empires, so they think that, like, oh, the reason why different countries become rich and some are poor is because, you have people going over, conquering other people, taking all their resources and stuff, right? That's very oversimplistic, and it doesn't actually bear up to any historical or economic scrutiny at all. So in the more recent times, we don't really, well, there's some empires one could argue, but we don't really tend to have empires in the same way we did like a century ago. But at the same time, like, standard of living, both of the rich countries and the poor countries, has drastically increased. So why is that then? And especially around the time when decolonization happened, why is that? And that's because empires are expensive, empires are inefficient, empires are just, they're not good in general, yeah. Never mind for the actual people themselves, it's actually not very good business, right? For the most part, when the Europeans took over a country, right, it was for one or two reasons, right? One, they just, in the same way with the Scramble for Africa, they just wanted to see lots of the map painted in the respective colour of their country, right? So it's kind of just for kind of glory and stuff, and to be like, oh, well, we have this much territory and we have this many people, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of why the Scramble for Africa happened. And then on the other part, it was a thing of the native rulers being like, we are refusing to trade with you, right? So if you look at India, for instance, the reason why you had so many princely states is because those princely states are the ones that were like, yeah, cool, we don't mind, cool, whatever, like, yeah, we'll trade with you guys, we don't really care. But the ones that resisted, they tend to be the ones that end up being conquered by the British, right, and directly ruled. So this is what you tend to find all around the world. Argentina, again, Argentina traded with the British. There was no need to make Argentina part of the British Empire, right? So when we kind of think about it like in those ways, yeah, the Chinese, through these unequal treaties, through all these different things, right, they were basically doing what the Europeans want them to do anyway. They're already trading with the Europeans. And so although you had like these little blips here and there with this or that war, this rebellion being crushed, yeah, by and large, the Europeans got what they wanted out of China. So what was the point in wasting all that time and resources, owning territory, govern over like hundreds of millions of people who every now and again they're going to rebel and they're going to have to put down another rebellion, etc., etc. It's very long, and so it didn't happen because there was no reason for it to have happened. Yeah, it would just cost the Europeans a hell of a lot, and it wouldn't have really been that much gain. Yeah, considering like what the alternative was, right? So anyway, with that being said, we are going to be looking at what might have happened if it had actually gone down this way, right? So first of all, we have to, if you look on the map here, the Europeans had certain spheres of influence, right? So this is places they didn't directly control, but where they had a lot of influence here. So they built a lot of railroads here, like there are various like different investments. So for instance, on the map here, you can see that, like the British tend to have a lot of support in like the south of the country, like around where Hong Kong is, but also along the Yangtze River, where like Shanghai is. So actually, interestingly enough, if you have a bank account with a HSBC stands for the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, right? So this gives you an idea of just how heavily invested the British were in China at this time, right? So this is kind of like the British sphere of influence. Then the French, they have a lot of influence in the province of Yunnan and also Zhuangxi. I'm probably mispronouncing these. So they tend to be down in the south. Also as well, the British, because of their possessions in India, also had a lot of control over Tibet. And then further north, you had the Russians, who had a lot of influence, right? So obviously Russia's got a massive border with China, so they kind of wanted control over the northern part. Then on the eastern coast, you have the Japanese. On top of that, you also have the Germans. And actually, the phrase yellow peril was first coined by Kaiser Wilhelm II. And also, this is where we get the term Huns from. So, so when we, in World War One, the British and everyone called like the Germans Huns. The reason for this is because Kaiser Wilhelm had a very famous speech here where he said that basically the Chinese would fear the Germans in the same way as they had done like the Huns like centuries before. And so he basically wanted to teach the Chinese a lesson, and he feared that like the so-called yellow race, the Chinese, would basically through their superior numbers basically end up taking over the whole world. So this is basically the fear of Kaiser Wilhelm. So the Germans had a port there as well. Also the Austro-Hungarians, actually I believe, as far as I'm aware, the only Austro-Hungarian foreign base or colony that they had outside their empire was actually in a tiny part of China and stuff, right? And actually also as well, those who have seen Sound of Music, you'll remember that Captain von Trapp, he had been a captain in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. He also served in this conflict, right? So he was part of the putting down of the Boxer Rebellion. So that's just a bit of trivia. But by and large, we're talking about the British, the French, the Russians, and the Japanese having a hand in this. So fast forward, how might we imagine like the rest of the 20th century and going into the 21st century? How might China and the world be? It's quite difficult to kind of say because each kind of colonial empire kind of governed in different ways. So it's not as if like you're saying like, oh, the British take over all of it and therefore you can just copy and paste like what the British did in India, etc. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So like, first of all, we have to kind of bear in mind that obviously World War II would happen, and as the Europeans their main focus is on what's going on in Europe, the Japanese took advantage of this and ended up taking over a vast swathe of East Asia and the Pacific, right? This more likely than not would again have happened in our own timeline. So the Japanese, they did end up taking Hong Kong. They did take a lot of these other places. So more likely than not, the Japanese would have taken their possessions there. But then on top of that, in the final days of World War II, the Soviets end up invading from the north and end up, especially in Manchuria. And this gave a lot of support to the communist leader Mao Zedong. And this, through the Soviet support, this ended up leading to, the communists taking over in 1949 during the Chinese Civil War. And this is how the CCP, the Communist Party of China, is taken over China today. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and basically say that, assuming, because this is the thing as well, so the British tended after a while to just give their colonies their independence. The French tended to fight on and really struggle for a long time with their colonies. We can see this in Vietnam with Dien Bien Phu and stuff. It takes for them to be actually properly defeated militarily for them to finally kind of concede. But let's assume, for simplicity's sake, you end up having a communist North China and up having a capitalist South China, right? So instead of the capitalists being basically made to flee to Formosa, which had been a Japanese colony, which like, today we call that Taiwan. So instead of them having to all flee to Taiwan, what if they had basically controlled the south of China and the communists had controlled the north? And as we said at the beginning of the video, northern China has different climate to southern China, and also as well in the south they tend to speak Cantonese more, and in the northeast they tend to speak more Mandarin. So it's not unfeasible that this could potentially have happened. But then how would this have changed like history, like kind of if this happened? Well, obviously, like the Vietnam War would probably have gone slightly differently if the Americans could have just invaded. Because the thing is, they didn't end up invading like in our own timeline, because in the Korean War, the Americans like took the thing all the way up to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese, out of fear of the Americans invading their own country, end up getting involved in the Korean War. That's why North Korea is about today. The Americans feared a similar thing would happen in Vietnam, which is why they never invaded North Vietnam, despite the fact North Vietnam was like invading the South. So maybe let's just say that, like, at very least the North Vietnamese kind of just surrender or whatever, and let's say that either the Americans end up overtaking the North, or they kind of just the North just surrenders and just goes, okay, there's going to be a North and South Vietnam, and that's just the end of it, right? How would like the rest of the region be going, right? Well, first of all, obviously, China today is, in the last 30 years, it's modernized a lot, it's traded a lot with the rest of the world. However, most of that trade is done in the southern ports and like on the eastern coast, so like Hong Kong, Shanghai, etc., etc. So this is already the kind of economic powerhouse of China, right? So obviously you've got places like in Beijing and stuff, but Beijing is not as commercially central as like Shanghai and all these other places are. So you'd see that a big difference between the kind of especially as well if they had like a 30-year head start on like the rest of the country. So today, obviously, China has only been industrialized and modernized for the last like 30 years or so. If they had a huge head start all the way like going back to the 50s, so there's no no great leap forward, there's no like big purges, no mass famines that caused by Mao. Like if none of that had happened in the South would probably be much further ahead than what the North is today. So yeah, China today would be very different than what we kind of imagine. And also on top of that, you have to bear in mind that that century of humiliation would have been far longer than a century, right? Even to this day, the Chinese would view the Westerners as, you invaded us, and you divided us, and now we're still divided as a result of you. So the Middle Kingdom, the Middle Empire, right? China is divided, and it's all because of foreigners, right? So kind of think of that in terms of like how China would like view the rest of the world, right? Based on their history and based on everything that's kind of happened to them. And the past really defines each country and how they view the rest of the world. It defines how we view the rest of the world, and definitely does for the Chinese, who, because they've had this continuous 3,000 years of civilization, it really we think in terms of like decades, they think in terms of centuries. And so with that being said, I hope you liked this video, and definitely stay tuned for our next video, which is probably going to be on Biafra. I really want to do the Brexit one, so as much as I like doing the research for this video and stuff, I did kind of really want to do the Brexit one because it was quite pressing. However, there's obviously the Biafra video where we talk about like decolonization in Africa. Maybe that one will go better as a aftermath of like this one. I don't know, let me know in the comment section what you prefer. And in the meantime, obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and on top of that, like, share with people as well. Sharing is caring. And also as well, hit us up on Instagram. We've got merch out there as well, so if you're interested in that, hit me up on Instagram, like message me and stuff. And that being said, have a great day and bye.